You are about to see the moment a routine call changed everything in a quiet American neighborhood. Marcus Reed stood outside his home in Arlington, Virginia, holding a phone call that would never finish the same way. He was known to the federal system as the FBI director, but to his neighbors, he was simply a calm man who kept to himself. That evening, the street looked ordinary, porch lights glowing, cars parked neatly along the curb, nothing suggesting what was about to unfold. When Officer Brian Harlow arrived, there was no sense of urgency, only a firm belief that he was responding to a standard complaint. A report had been filed, vague and unverified, describing a possible security concern near the residence. Harlow did not question the lack of detail, nor did he wait for confirmation before stepping forward. What he saw was a man at the doorway, composed, still speaking calmly into his phone, not resisting, not reacting. Yet assumptions formed quickly in the space between observation and judgment, shaping what would happen next. The officer's voice carried authority as he instructed Marcus to step away from the entrance and place his hands where they could be seen. Marcus ended his call slowly, his expression unchanged, as if processing a moment that felt strangely disconnected from reality. Around them, the neighborhood began to notice, curtains shifting, phones lifting, silence stretching across the street like an invisible thread. Harlow moved closer, maintaining control of the situation as he perceived it, unaware of how fragile that perception truly was. Marcus did not argue, did not raise his voice, only followed instructions with a patience that made no attempt to challenge the moment. In that quiet exchange, identity meant nothing visible. Only what each person believed about the other shaped the unfolding events. Somewhere miles away, systems were already capable of recognizing who Marcus Reed was, but none of that information had been accessed yet. The world at street level remained unaware of the weight hidden behind a single name, a name that carried authority far beyond the block. As neighbors recorded from behind windows and door frames, the scene appeared ordinary on the surface, but tension grew in the stillness. Officer Harlow made a decision that would later be reviewed across multiple agencies, believing he was acting within routine procedure. Marcus remained standing, calm and unreadable, as if waiting for something that only he seemed to understand was already in motion. The evening air felt heavier, not because of noise or movement, but because of what had not yet been realized by those present. In that silence, every second stretched longer than the last, as if the street itself was waiting for a signal that no one could yet see, a chain of responses already forming beyond the horizon of that quiet neighborhood, where a single misunderstanding was about to reach far beyond local authority itself. The stillness on the street began to shift in ways that were not immediately visible to those standing outside Marcus Reed's home. Officer Brian Harlow maintained his position with steady professionalism, unaware that the situation he believed to be routine was already being quietly evaluated by systems far beyond his awareness. Inside Marcus Reed's world, however, nothing was random. Every interaction he had, every location he visited, and every device he carried operated within a structured federal framework designed for both protection and oversight. At that moment, a subtle alert began to register within secure federal monitoring channels, not triggered by panic or escalation, but by a mismatch between location data and identity clearance protocols. Miles away, in a controlled operations environment, analysts began to notice a flagged inconsistency tied to a name that required immediate verification. The name Marcus Reed carried weight in every federal database it appeared in, and any irregular interaction involving him was treated with quiet urgency rather than public reaction. Meanwhile, outside the home, Officer Harlow continued following standard procedure, requesting identification confirmation and maintaining a controlled perimeter. Marcus remained composed, his posture unchanged, his attention calm and deliberate, as if he were fully aware that the situation unfolding was being observed from multiple unseen angles. A neighbor across the street lowered their phone slightly, uncertain whether what they were witnessing was a misunderstanding or something more procedural in nature. The atmosphere remained quiet, but the silence was no longer neutral. It had become layered with anticipation. Inside federal communication channels, a secondary verification request was initiated, seeking confirmation of Officer Harlow's engagement status and jurisdictional authority at the location. The system did not yet classify the encounter as an emergency, but it had moved beyond routine observation. Marcus did not resist or escalate the interaction, instead allowing the process to continue while maintaining full awareness of the structure surrounding him. Every detail, from the time of arrival to the absence of pre-approved coordination, was being logged and compared against standard federal engagement protocols. Officer Harlow, focused on immediate procedure, interpreted Marcus's calmness as compliance, unaware that silence in such a context often carried more significance than words. The neighborhood remained still, but the weight of observation grew heavier as more residents became aware that something unusual was taking place. Window blinds shifted again, and a second phone began recording from a different angle. Within federal systems, Marcus's status was being cross-referenced with active field operations, revealing that he was not only cleared for unrestricted access, but also designated under protected operational status. This information had not yet reached the street-level interaction. The gap between knowledge and perception continued to widen. Officer Harlow adjusted his stance slightly, maintaining control of the scene as he understood it, while the system above him began preparing silent contingencies. Marcus finally shifted his gaze toward the street ahead, not toward the officer, but toward the quiet horizon beyond the neighborhood, as if acknowledging that what was happening in this single location was already expanding into something much larger than anyone present could see. The quiet tension outside the residence continued to evolve, in ways that were invisible to those standing at street level. Officer Brian Harlow maintained his controlled posture, still believing that the situation was contained within the boundaries of a routine field response. While unknown to him, multiple federal coordination channels were now actively engaged in silent review of the encounter. Inside secure communication networks, Marcus Reed's identity verification had moved beyond preliminary checks and entered a priority confirmation state, not because of suspicion directed at him, but because of the sensitivity attached to any interaction involving his designation. In federal systems, his role was classified at a level where even minor inconsistencies triggered structured review protocols designed to ensure absolute accuracy before any external escalation occurred. At the same time, a secondary layer of communication began forming between regional federal offices and internal oversight divisions, creating a quiet but expanding web of awareness that something at a residential location in Arlington required structured attention. Marcus remained calm, his presence steady, his attention divided not by confusion but by observation, as if he could already perceive the invisible machinery responding beyond the street. The neighbor recordings continued, capturing not just the interaction itself, but the growing sense that the moment was no longer isolated. Subtle changes in the environment became noticeable, such as the increase in distant vehicle movement patterns and the brief pauses of passing traffic that seemed to adjust without clear reason. Officer Harlow received a standard confirmation request on his device asking for jurisdictional validation and incident classification details, a procedure he followed without hesitation, still unaware that the classification being evaluated on the other end of the system carried implications far beyond a neighborhood inquiry. Within federal coordination rooms, analysts reviewed location data, identity confirmation logs, and temporal markers of engagement, constructing a timeline that was now expanding into multiple agencies. The phrase internal protected status verification appeared within the system, signaling that Marcus Reed's presence at the location had triggered protocols reserved for sensitive oversight scenarios. Despite this, there was still no public escalation, only a quiet and deliberate preparation that unfolded behind layers of administrative structure. Marcus finally shifted his stance slightly, not in reaction to pressure, but in acknowledgment of the structured nature of what was occurring around him. His expression remained composed, reflecting an understanding that systems were now aligning toward resolution at a level not visible to the immediate participants. Officer Harlow adjusted his position once more, continuing to operate under the assumption that compliance and procedure would define the outcome of the interaction, unaware that the procedural framework he relied on was now being cross-referenced against higher authority confirmation chains. In federal coordination channels, the phrase standby for field synchronization appeared, indicating that external units were being prepared in case identity verification reached full confirmation status. The neighborhood itself remained outwardly unchanged, yet those paying close attention could sense a shift in presence, as if the space had expanded beyond its physical boundaries. Marcus's calm demeanor stood in contrast to the increasing complexity unfolding behind the scenes, creating a dual reality where one side saw a simple enforcement interaction while the other processed a structured federal acknowledgment sequence. The system did not rush, but it did not hesitate either, and within that balance, the moment continued to develop toward an outcome that no one on the street could yet fully comprehend. The atmosphere outside the residence began to feel increasingly structured, as if invisible layers of authority were quietly aligning above the street without disrupting its outward calm. Officer Brian Harlow remained focused on the immediate interaction, but subtle changes in his communication device indicated that the situation had moved beyond a simple field report. A second confirmation request appeared, this time requesting direct validation of identity, verification progress, and situational classification update within the local command system. Harlow followed procedure, still interpreting each step as standard protocol, unaware that every input he submitted was now being evaluated in parallel by multiple federal oversight layers. Inside secure coordination environments, Marcus Reed's identity confirmation reached a decisive stage where automated systems began matching restricted clearance profiles with active location presence. This was not an escalation driven by suspicion, but rather by structured recognition of authority that required precise handling before any further external actions were permitted. In these systems, Marcus Reed was not treated as an unknown subject, but as a high-level federal authority whose presence outside expected operational parameters required immediate procedural alignment. As this confirmation cycle progressed, a quiet shift occurred within regional coordination channels, where senior analysts began reviewing the engagement timeline in real time. The data presented a clear and increasingly undeniable picture that the interaction taking place on the street had already moved beyond standard jurisdictional boundaries. Meanwhile, Marcus remained composed, his attention steady, his posture unchanged, as if he were observing the system respond around him rather than being affected by it. His silence carried a different weight now, not one of uncertainty, but of patience rooted in awareness of processes unfolding beyond immediate perception. On the street, neighbors continued to watch, their recordings now capturing not just the interaction itself, but the subtle sense that the environment was responding in ways they could not fully interpret. Small details began to stand out, such as the brief pauses in passing traffic patterns and the growing presence of unmarked vehicles that did not immediately engage but positioned themselves at a distance consistent with observation protocols. Officer Harlow noticed a shift in tone from his communication channel, where instructions were becoming less directive and more confirmatory, indicating that additional oversight had been introduced into the review chain. At the same time, a new internal notification appeared within federal systems, marking Marcus Reed's status as fully verified under protected federal designation, which immediately elevated the priority level of all associated interactions. Despite this, there was still no public disruption, only a careful and deliberate synchronization of authority that remained hidden from street-level perception. Marcus finally adjusted his gaze slightly toward the surrounding area, not in reaction to the officer, but as if acknowledging that the system surrounding him had reached a point of recognition. The air itself seemed unchanged, yet the structure of authority operating beneath it had shifted in a way that was now irreversible. Every participant on the street remained within their immediate understanding of events, unaware that the framework defining their interaction had already expanded into a far larger operational context. The quiet continued, but it was no longer empty, as it carried the weight of confirmation, alignment, and the approaching moment when perception and reality would no longer match at the street level. The moment outside the residence continued to unfold with a precision that no one on the street could fully interpret, as if the environment itself had entered a quiet state of anticipation. Officer Brian Harlow remained in position, his attention fixed on the immediate procedures he believed were still governing the interaction, while the communication device in his hand now reflected a noticeably different tone from earlier exchanges. Requests arriving through official channels were no longer routine confirmations, but structured acknowledgments requiring higher-level review signatures before any further local action could be considered valid. Within federal coordination systems, Marcus Reed's identity verification had now fully transitioned into confirmed protected status, triggering a formal alignment process across multiple oversight divisions that operated independently from local enforcement authority. This transition did not create noise or visible disruption at the street level, but instead initiated a silent synchronization protocol designed to ensure that all actions taken in proximity to the individual were consistent with federal oversight requirements. Marcus remained calm, his presence unchanged, yet the stillness around him now carried a different quality, as if the space between each second had become more deliberate. Inside federal monitoring environments, analysts reviewed the full timeline of the encounter, noting that the initial assumptions made at the local level had not accounted for the identity layer now confirmed. This discrepancy did not result in immediate reaction, but rather in structured preparation for alignment between agencies. Meanwhile, additional confirmation nodes activated across regional command centers, quietly preparing coordination channels that would ensure unified response once procedural thresholds were met. On the street, the visual appearance of the situation remained deceptively ordinary, with neighbors still observing from windows and doorways, unaware that the informational structure behind the interaction had already evolved beyond what they could see. Officer Harlow received a final procedural update requesting confirmation of detainment status classification, a step that now felt increasingly formalized rather than discretionary. His focus remained on completing protocol, but subtle changes in response timing from his communication channel suggested that external review authority had fully engaged with the situation. Marcus turned his attention slightly toward the residence entrance, his expression steady and controlled, as if acknowledging the completion of a phase that had been unfolding quietly around him. Within federal systems, a readiness indicator appeared signaling that synchronized field coordination units were now on standby, awaiting final authorization for structured engagement if required. This did not represent escalation in the traditional sense, but rather the alignment of multiple independent authorities converging on a single verified identity event. The neighborhood itself remained still, yet the perception of stillness had changed, carrying an undercurrent of expectation that could not be explained by those observing it directly. Every system involved now operated under the same verified assumption, and while no visible action had yet occurred, the framework supporting the situation had already shifted into its final preparatory state, where only confirmation of acknowledgment remained before the full structure of oversight would become visible to the street-level reality. The final phase of quiet alignment outside the residence unfolded with a precision that remained invisible to anyone standing on the street, yet increasingly structured within the systems observing from above. Officer Brian Harlow maintained his position near the entrance, his attention still directed toward the immediate procedural steps he believed defined the interaction, while the communication channels in his device now reflected a level of authority confirmation that extended far beyond local command. Each update arriving through official routing no longer resembled routine field instructions, but instead carried the tone of verified oversight acknowledgment, requiring multi-level authorization tracking before any further action could be validated. Within federal coordination environments, Marcus Reed's protected status had now been fully confirmed across all required verification layers, triggering synchronized readiness protocols that connected regional, national, and oversight divisions into a unified awareness state. This did not create visible movement or disruption at street level, but instead established a structured condition where all potential outcomes were being prepared in advance of any public transition. Analysts monitoring the situation noted that the interaction had reached a stabilization point where no further uncertainty remained in identity classification, only in procedural resolution timing. Marcus stood calmly in front of his residence, his posture unchanged, yet his awareness appeared aligned with the quiet transition occurring around him, as if he could sense the completion of each invisible confirmation layer as it locked into place. The neighborhood itself remained outwardly unchanged, with porch lights steady and distant traffic continuing at a normal pace, but those Observing closely could sense a subtle shift in atmosphere, a feeling that the moment had expanded beyond its original boundaries. Inside federal systems, a final coordination notice was issued indicating that all relevant units were now in synchronized standby, awaiting a single authorization threshold that would transition the situation from observation to full structured response if required. This readiness state was not reactive but preparatory, designed to ensure that any interaction involving Marcus Reed would be managed under unified authority without delay or conflict between jurisdictions. Officer Harlow received what appeared to be a standard procedural confirmation, but the language had subtly changed, reflecting elevated clearance involvement that removed discretionary interpretation from the local level. Marcus finally turned his gaze toward the street ahead, not toward any individual present, but toward the broader space, as if acknowledging the completion of a process that had been unfolding beyond perception. The silence in the environment deepened, not because of absence of activity, but because of the weight of alignment that now defined every layer of the situation. Even the smallest movements, such as shifting observers behind windows or passing vehicles slowing at a distance, felt as though they were part of a larger structured awareness forming around the location. Within federal coordination centers, the final status indicator moved from verification complete to operational readiness confirmed, signaling that the system had fully recognized the identity at the center of the event. No action had yet been taken publicly, but every necessary component for immediate structured response now existed in place, forming a silent architecture of authority surrounding the moment. The interaction on the street had not escalated in noise or force, yet it had reached a threshold where the next shift would no longer remain invisible to those present, marking the point where quiet procedural alignment would finally transition into visible acknowledgment of the truth that had been operating beneath the surface from the very beginning. The final stage of stillness outside the residence shifted in a way that was no longer subtle, as the structured alignment of federal oversight began transitioning from invisible coordination into visible presence. Officer Brian Harlow, still positioned near the entrance, sensed a change in the environment that did not originate from anything within his immediate control or training, as the communication device in his hand updated once more with a status he had not encountered in routine field operations. The message was no longer framed as a request or confirmation, but as a directive acknowledgement indicating that federal-level authority had fully engaged with the location and that all local procedural actions were now subject to immediate structured review. Within federal coordination systems, Marcus Reed's identity had reached final verification across all channels, activating synchronized response protocols that were designed not to escalate conflict, but to ensure unified authority alignment across agencies. This activation was not loud, nor disruptive in its initial phase, but instead manifested as a coordinated arrival pattern that began forming at the perimeter of the neighborhood. From the street level, subtle changes became noticeable as unmarked vehicles positioned themselves at controlled distances, not blocking movement, but establishing structured observation boundaries consistent with federal operational protocol. The atmosphere remained quiet, but the nature of that quiet had changed, carrying the weight of confirmed recognition rather than uncertainty. Marcus Reed stood calmly near the entrance of his residence, his posture unchanged, yet now fully aligned with the final stage of procedural transition that had been building since the beginning of the interaction. His expression remained steady, reflecting neither surprise nor urgency, as if the unfolding response was not an interruption but a completion of process. Inside federal coordination environments, the arrival sequence was logged as synchronized deployment readiness confirmed, indicating that all required units had transitioned into position according to pre-established protocol. There was no sense of disorder, only structured convergence, where each element of authority moved into place with deliberate precision. Officer Harlow received a final system update that removed all discretionary interpretation from the situation, replacing it with formal acknowledgment of federal oversight assumption of control. At that moment, the perceived boundaries of the interaction expanded beyond the immediate street, as additional personnel from oversight divisions and federal coordination teams established communication continuity with local command structures. The neighborhood itself remained visually unchanged, Yet the presence of structured authority created an unmistakable shift in perception for those observing from outside. Curtains shifted, phones remained raised, and silence deepened further as the realization began to form that the situation was no longer local in scope. Marcus finally turned slightly toward the assembled environment, his attention steady, acknowledging the full transition of authority alignment now complete around him. Within federal systems, the final confirmation was recorded, marking the interaction as fully synchronized under protected federal designation, with all associated protocols now active and visible across coordinated channels. No further uncertainty remained in classification, only the formal acknowledgment of structure that had already been established. The street, once defined by routine perception, now existed within a framework of layered authority that had been quietly built from the first moment of contact. And as the final phase settled into place, the distinction between observation and recognition dissolved completely, leaving only the clear and structured reality of confirmed federal presence surrounding the moment. The final transition that had been building across every layer of the situation reached a point where the environment outside Marcus Reed's residence was no longer defined by observation alone, but by structured federal confirmation that was now fully active across all connected channels. Officer Brian Harlow stood at the edge of the interaction space, his posture still controlled but now visibly influenced by the change in procedural authority that had replaced all prior assumptions of local jurisdiction. The communication device in his hand no longer functioned as a tool for field updates in the traditional sense, but instead displayed synchronized federal directives confirming that the situation had been fully assumed under protected operational oversight. Within federal coordination systems, the arrival of field units was no longer a possibility, but an executed phase, with structured deployment confirmed across multiple access points surrounding the area in controlled formation. The presence of these units remained deliberately non-disruptive, maintaining distance and observation alignment consistent with high-level federal protocol, ensuring that no escalation would occur at the visible level while authority transfer was finalized through formal channels. Marcus Reed remained composed at the entrance of his home, his presence steady and unchanged, as if the entire progression of events had been moving toward this exact moment of acknowledgment from the beginning. His attention was calm, directed not toward the individuals around him, but toward the broader structure that had now fully revealed itself in layers of coordinated authority. Inside federal systems, the final confirmation stage had been recorded, marking the interaction as fully synchronized under national oversight classification, with all participating divisions now operating under unified procedural command. The neighborhood, once defined by ordinary perception, now existed within a structured boundary of federal awareness, where every movement, every observation, and every recorded detail was being processed in real time through integrated oversight channels. Officer Harlow received a final directive acknowledgment indicating immediate transition from independent field action to supervised procedural compliance, effectively removing any remaining discretion from the local level. At the same time, additional communication nodes confirmed that all required verification steps had been completed without discrepancy, solidifying Marcus Reed's protected designation across all active systems. The air remained still, yet the meaning of that stillness had transformed entirely, carrying the weight of full systemic recognition rather than uncertainty or delay. Marcus finally shifted his gaze slightly toward the assembled perimeter, not as a reaction, but as a quiet acknowledgment that the process had reached completion at every level above and around him. Within federal coordination centers, the final status update confirmed full operational alignment achieved, signaling that all entities involved were now synchronized under a single structured authority framework. No further procedural ambiguity remained. Only the completed transition from local misunderstanding to confirmed federal oversight presence. The street, once defined by a simple interaction, now stood within a fully integrated structure of authority that had unfolded silently from the first moment of contact. And as the final acknowledgement settled across all systems, the distinction between perception and verified reality dissolved entirely into a unified operational state of confirmed control and recognition. The final moment of full alignment arrived with a calm precision that contrasted sharply with the earlier uncertainty of the situation, as every layer of federal coordination reached its completed state around Marcus Reed's location. The street outside his residence no longer felt like a place of isolated judgment or local procedure, but rather a structured point within a much larger system of confirmed authority. Officer Brian Harlow stood still, his posture now reflecting awareness rather than control, as the communication device in his hand displayed the final directive acknowledgment confirming full federal assumption of oversight. Around him, the presence of coordinated federal units remained steady and deliberate, positioned in a way that established clear boundaries of authority without creating disruption or disorder in the visible environment. The neighborhood itself had fallen into a silence that felt different from before, no longer shaped by curiosity or confusion, but by the realization that the situation had reached a level of formal recognition beyond local jurisdiction. Marcus Reed remained composed at the entrance of his home, his expression calm and steady, as if the entire progression of events had been moving toward a defined conclusion that was now fully realized. His attention shifted slightly toward the assembled environment, not with tension or reaction, but with a measured awareness that reflected complete understanding of the structured transition that had taken place around him. Inside federal coordination systems, the final status confirmation had already been recorded across all required channels, marking the interaction as fully resolved under protected federal designation and unified operational oversight. There was no urgency remaining in the system, only completion, as all participating divisions confirmed synchronization under a single authoritative framework. Officer Harlow received a final procedural instruction that formally transferred all remaining local authority into federal oversight review, concluding his direct control over the situation in a manner consistent with established protocol. The change was not dramatic in appearance, but absolute in effect, signaling the end of independent field interpretation at the street level. Nearby observers remained still, their earlier uncertainty replaced by quiet recognition that something far beyond a routine encounter had taken place in front of them. Marcus took a slow step forward, not away from the situation, but into its resolution, his presence steady and deliberate as he acknowledged the completion of every procedural layer that had unfolded since the beginning. Within federal systems, the final verification marker displayed full operational closure, indicating that all necessary confirmations had been completed without discrepancy and that the situation was now fully contained within structured oversight records. The coordinated units maintained position briefly before entering a stable monitoring state, ensuring that all formal documentation and procedural alignment were finalized according to protocol. The environment itself returned to a calm stillness, but it was no longer the same stillness that had existed before, as it now carried the weight of resolved authority and confirmed recognition. Marcus's expression remained unchanged as he looked across the quiet street one final time, not as a subject of the event, but as the central point around which the entire structure had organized itself. In that final moment, the distinction between misunderstanding and verified truth dissolved completely, leaving only the clear and unified reality of completed federal acknowledgment, where every action, every system, and every observation had converged into a single resolved state that required no further explanation or continuation.